Hi, I'm Karen Arnold, coming to you from my studio in Needle and Thread Quilts. I'm coming to you on behalf of the Heart of Ohio Quilt Guild. It seems like we've been planning this for a long time, but through COVID we haven't been able to get together. So we're going to be either doing it in person, in Zoom, or through this video about how to take care of your quilts. How many of you own quilts? Any vintage quilts? Quilting has been important to my family for at least 4 generations, and we have many of the quilts from my husband's family as well. I've had to research on how to best take care of them. Tonight I want to talk a bit about how to take care of the quilts that you might have and share a bit about quilts that are in my family and how we've cared for them to make them last through the years. I thought I'd start by sharing some quilts from my husband's side of the family. They were made by my husband's great-grandmother, Retta Whipple, who was an amazing quilter. She was born in 1873 and died in 1966 at the age of 93. My father-in-law still owns about 15 of her quilts, which are in excellent condition. Their condition is probably due to the fact that my mother-in-law didn't use them. She preferred store-bought quilts. Retta's quilts still look pretty good for being about 85 years old or so. Don't store your quilts in plastic. The plastic will trap the humidity and cause your quilts to mold. The ideal is to store your quilts on a flat bed, but limit the number of quilts to prevent tears from the weight. When I go to my father-in-law's house, it's my job to refold the quilts on a regular basis so they don't get permanent folds. Keep your quilts out of direct sunlight. I have a friend who made a beautiful purple quilt. She used it on her bed for a long time until she realized that the sunlight coming in from her French doors in her bedroom had faded one side of her quilt. There really isn't anything that you can do once a quilt is faded, and she wasn't able to save it. When my husband and I were traveling in Tennessee, we saw many quilt dealers who were displaying their quilts outside in the sunlight all day, every day. I can only imagine the damage that was done. Preventing problems with quilts is so important instead of dealing with the issues afterward. Keep your treasured quilts away from pets or away from places where they may be stained and such. If your quilt has a little musty odor or just needs airing out, try airing them on a clothesline covered with a white sheet to prevent that fading, or in a cool dryer for a short time. If you do wash your quilt, you never want to dry it in the dryer. You will want to air dry it, and then you can fluff it in the dryer a little bit if you like. If your quilt is dusty, you can put it in a cool dryer for a short period of time, and that helps get the dust out of the fabrics. Washing is a huge gamble for a quilt, and there's so many things that can go wrong. So most experts say that you shouldn't wash your quilt unless it is absolutely necessary, and then with great caution. My mom always said that don't wash a quilt unless you absolutely have to, and then don't. If you do have to wash a quilt, use special soap just for quilts. Soak it, put it in a big tub, and use a new plunger to work it. This is a quilt that my great-grandmother Sadie made. She had 7 boys. One of those boys was my great-uncle Lee. He was a steel mill worker and enjoyed dressing up in wool suits and playing cards with his friends and such. The story goes that he didn't like to dry clean or wash the suits, and he piled them up in a corner. She threatened to cut them up for quilts if he didn't take care of them. He told her to go ahead. I would probably never wash this quilt for several reasons. First of all, it's extremely heavy, and if I washed it in water, I probably wouldn't be able to lift it to squeeze out the water. Since it's wool, it would probably shrink. There is some damage around the outside, but for being about 70 or 80 years old, I think it's pretty good shape. If your quilt has any damage, you'll want to repair it before you wash it. If your quilt has any ink signatures, unstable dyes, deteriorating fabrics, silks, velvets, or wool fabrics, don't wash it. Color catchers are amazing if you feel that you need to wash a quilt that you're concerned about bleeding. Never dry clean your quilt. The chemicals are too harsh for the long term. If your quilt has damage, you need to evaluate it to see if your quilt is worth the time and expense to repair it. A few years ago, my father-in-law, my husband, and I found a garbage bag with this quilt in it out in his garage port. As you can see, it's in very bad shape. It has holes and staining. My father-in-law has no idea where it came from. Since he and my mother-in-law were only children, it's easier to figure out who made it or where it may have come from. My mother-in-law did not quilt, and neither did her mom. Since it's pink and it is older, we figured that it was my mother-in-law's and was made possibly by her grandmother. It is now my poster child for a quilt that has gone too far. I won't be repairing this one. Repair any loose seams and make them secure. This is a glorified 9-patch that I found in the bottom of a box at my father-in-law's house. This block had some damage to it. In another box, I found some other fabric scraps and some of the exact fabric that was used, so I was able to replace just that one piece. Most of the time, you don't luck out like that. Sometimes you have to applique over the damaged piece. The fabrics don't have to be a perfect match, but it should be similar in color and look like that time period. Reproduction fabrics help a lot with that. I appliqued over the damaged pieces here and left the original fabric. Which fabrics did I replace? Here is a double wedding ring quilt that was damaged around the binding in several pieces of the ring. The pieces that have clips on them are pieces that I appliqued over. There was another quilt in the garbage bag in my father-in-law's garage port. There were a few tears and it was stained pretty badly. I had heard about RetroClean and decided to give it a try. After soaking it for about 30 hours in RetroClean and then line drying it, it looked like this. Not too bad. It's a truly amazing restoration. I thought because of the stains, I thought I was going to have to throw it away. I'm glad I didn't need to. I call this quilt my Lazarus quilt. There was a tear in the outer border. I used another product that I found called Bone Ash to help with this. With Bone Ash, basically you make an iron-on patch from another piece of fabric. You sprinkle the Bone Ash powder on the right side of the fabric and use the Teflon sheets to iron it on. If you have a tear, you simply slip the patch underneath the tear and then you iron it on. It is amazing how you really can't see the tear when you're all finished, and it is not noticeable at all. This is a quilt that my great-grandmother Sadie made. It was tied but was taken apart, probably due to some damage. It is made using some feed sacks. You can see some of the printing from the back, which is really the right side of the fabric. I didn't know about Bone Ash back then when I started to repair this, so I used a fusible interfacing on the back and then zigzag to secure the damage. It's another technique and I'll probably leave it, but I prefer the Bone Ash method. When you are finishing an unfinished quilt from another time period, it is hard to match the color exactly. My grandmother pieced many of these blocks and my mom finished it. You can see that my grandma's yellow is much lighter than my mom's, but that's okay, it's finished. My neighbor brought me a quilt that she found and wanted it repaired. The pink was going to be hard to match. It had a very wide binding and it had some tears in it. I was able to cut the excess off and use it for the binding. I just made sure that the wear lines on the binding were on the inside of the folded binding that I put back on. If your quilt has a tiny hole, A very small amount of fray check will keep it from getting worse, and it won't be noticeable. Crazy quilts became popular in the 1800s. This one is not that old. My grandmother made it in the 1930s. There wasn't any special embroidery work or embellishments. Some of the fabrics, probably some satins or velvets, deteriorated and needed replaced. It was tied, so my mom took it apart, replaced the deteriorating fabrics, and had it quilted by a long-arm quilter. The backing and the binding are new. It is now very stable and it should last a long time. Looks pretty good for being at least 80 years old. During the Great Depression, fabric was hard to come by. These feed sacks were my grandmother's. My grandfather worked in a feed mill and tried to bring home matching ones. My grandmother was an excellent seamstress and quilter, and she made her 4 boys' shirts as well as for my grandfather and dresses for herself. I understand that 3 of the feed sacks made a dress. Her sister Leota was also an excellent seamstress who sewed for other people. She sewed for her 5 girls and saved a lot of the scraps for my grandmother, and she turned them into quilts. My mom had wanted to make a churn dash quilt on point from the feed sacks, but never got around to it. One Christmas I decided to make it for her. But at about halfway through piecing the quilt top, my domestic machine died. I panicked. I thought about trying to borrow or rent a sewing machine, but then I remembered that I had my other great-grandma's Ohio Farmer Treadle sewing machine. The problem was I didn't know how to use it. I learned how to use my over 100-year-old Treadle sewing machine using YouTube. It's amazing what technology can do for us these days. In trying to use up some of my grandma's scraps, I made this 12-block quilt top. These blocks were featured in a book called Egg Money Quilts that featured the most popular quilts of the 1930s. I know my grandma had made at least 3, possibly 4 of them. I thought it was a good use of the fabrics that I had. Stains can be tricky, and you need to decide what you can live with. I like to start with Tide pens first and then soak the stain. It's okay if you can't get them all out. Color bleeds actually scare me. Because I usually don't wash my quilts, this really isn't a big issue, but occasionally it does come up. From what I hear from the experts, you should soak them in a good measure of Dawn dish detergent and hot water from 12 to 24 hours. Does anyone have any other methods in dealing with color bleeds? It used to be my goal that I wouldn't leave any unfinished projects, but I don't think that this is going to be possible. In fact, it's probably been worse lately than ever. My grandma left several that my sister and I had been working on. My mom found several of these blocks that my grandma had embroidered, but wasn't sure how to finish them. She eventually found an advertisement in a magazine that featured some of the same blocks and ordered it. The blocks feature scenes through American history and have numbers on them. Because we are sure that my grandmother embroidered these blocks, my mom embroidered in the lower corners that my grandmother embroidered the squares and that she pieced and quilted the quilt. After not knowing about so many of the quilts or where they came from or who made them, I'm appreciating labels more and more. Labels can include who made the quilt, the date it was made, the occasion it was made, pictures, messages, or where the quilt came from. Labels can be simple or fancy. They can be made from Sharpies or fabric pens or pre-printed labels that they sell by the yard or in panels. They can be made by using color-fast sheets or with a liquid called bubble jet set that you soak your fabric in, iron the fabric onto freezer paper, and cut it into 8.5 by 11 sheets and then run it through your printer. This is a Lone Star quilt that my grandma made. It is hand-pieced and hand-quilted. It actually won a blue ribbon at the Trumbull County Free Fair in 1950. There was a tag folded up in the quilt, and I was afraid that it would get lost or misplaced, so I made a bubble jet set tag and appliqued it to the back. This is one of my favorites. Labels can be fancy. I bought these label patterns recently because I thought they were so cool. Now I need to make them. I'm committed. Remember that churn dash quilt? It told an interesting story, so I had to use the bubble jet set method to make a label that told that story. Also on the back is half of a feed sack that I found in the UFO chest. The other half of the sack was probably used, but you can see that it says that it held 100 pounds of kiln-dried granulated salt. Quality product, Farm Bureau Co-op, Columbus. I like it on the back, and it has become useful again instead of sitting in a box. One of my sister's projects was to complete another example of my grandmother's embroidery. There were 24 squares. These patterns were apparently printed in the Cleveland Plain Dealer, but she was missing the first one. She found a pattern that they were selling online, and they showed the first one as their ad nibbler. My sister embroidered the first lilac one and pieced it together and hand quilted it. She needs to put a label on it though. One of the challenges in finishing a UFO is dealing with varying sizes of blocks. That was certainly the case in this quilt made by my great-grandma Sadie. There were 24 blocks and they differed in size greatly. Because of this, I put 4 of them on point in the center and the front, added some wide sashings in the outer blocks that hopefully didn't show the varying sizes very much, and I put 4 squares on the back that were up to 2 inches smaller in size than the largest block on the front. Sometimes you have to be creative. I gave this quilt to my uncle and he loved it. It seems like orphaned blocks can be challenging. These were found in that same garbage bag in my father-in-law's garage port. I don't know where they came from. I don't know who made them. They look to have some age. I'm not sure what I will do with them, but I may sew some of them together and frame them for my studio. And sometimes you have to repurpose. In my grandma's box, there was a doily that had a hole in it, a yo-yo pillow that had satin that had disintegrated, some tatting samples that she probably practiced with, a lace piece, and lots of buttons. I decided that making a wall hanging would be much better than it sitting in a box. There were actually enough yo-yos for 3 wall hangings. I hope this video has been helpful and enjoyable to you as you take care of your quilts. Take care of you, take care of your quilts, and I hope they will be warmth and comfort to you for many years to come. Thanks. Bye-bye.